an age-old question. Why do bad things happen if God exists? And why did God make the world the way that God did? In Western thought, it's been going on for centuries. The problem of animal suffering is similar, is a younger problem. Well, there were a few things that kind of gave rise to it. One of them was in the 1600s in Europe, middle class, it became common in Europe to own pets. People weren't just encountering animals out in the field, they had them at home. So their thoughts and their familiarity with animals started becoming greater in the Western mind. Many, even defenders of theism, didn't really spend much time looking at the nature of animal pain and suffering. They just assumed it was something you had to give a good reason for God to allow.
The atheists are saying if there's animal suffering, there is no God. And the young earth creationists are saying basically there is a God, therefore there was no animal suffering
before Adam and Eve sinned. William Rowe, his famous argument from gratuitous suffering in his article, The Problem of Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism from 1979. Rowe say that God can only allow evil for a good reason. It has to bring about a greater good, or it has to prevent a equal evil. And if there was no reason for God allowing it, it would be what would be called a gratuitous evil, basically a pointless evil. When you look at the human world, the animal kingdom, you see so many instances of evil that seem to be gratuitous. Look at the nature of animal pain and suffering and ask, is a fawn burning in the woods for 4 days before it dies because it's trapped under a tree, is that gratuitous suffering? And this kind of builds and builds and builds a case against God's existence. Paul Draper, Christian Theism and Life on Earth, he wrote it in 2012, and he approaches naturalism, what he calls the no design hypothesis, and theism, both theories that he's going to test out against the evidence found in the world. And he basically considers evolutionary theory added to naturalism and evolutionary theory added to theism, and he has to see which one has the most explanatory power. And when he looks in the world, he sees that all these animals are, for such a long time, had diseases, they've been dying, they're suffering, and he thinks that that's really surprising according to what you would expect the world to be like according to theism. But it's exactly what you would expect if the world was ran by blind laws of nature. So he thinks that the no design hypothesis has more explanatory power, and therefore likely theism is false.
Richard Dawkins wrote a book called River Out of Eden, a Darwinian view of life. And he says, the total amount of suffering per year in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. During the minute it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive. Others are running for their lives, whimpering with fear. Others are being slowly devoured from within by rasping parasites. Thousands of all kinds are dying of starvation, thirst, and disease. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference.
Descartes' view, his mind-body dualism, his view on what makes a human person, that a human person is essentially an immaterial soul or mind joined to a physical body. The soul is the principle that gives human beings the ability to have consciousness. And what that entails for animals is that if animals aren't thought to have a soul like humans do, then animals aren't going to be conscious of anything. Animals more like machines than they are beings. They will react to their environment, but the lights aren't on, basically. And there's been philosophers who have defended the problem of animal suffering, defended theism from a neo-Cartesian perspective. One argument that I found interesting was from a philosopher named Peter Harrison, and he argued that if animals were the product of evolution, it wouldn't make sense for evolution to not only make animals have the pain avoidance behaviors, but also have them be conscious of the behaviors the same. He argued that as long as the behaviors were built into the animals, it didn't matter whether they're conscious of their pain or not. Probably impossible to imagine what it's like to be a fawn suffering, because when you're doing it, you are casting your consciousness upon that imaginary awareness of what it's like to be a fawn. Aquinas thought that the main difference between animals and humans is that non-human animals aren't self-aware. And this has big implications for the debate, because basically when animals suffer, they don't suffer as persons. They don't know that they're suffering as a person. They don't will it to stop. I mean, obviously they're moving around and trying to avoid it, but that's more on the level of instincts and pain avoidance behaviors. There is the experience of pain in this organism, but it's not a self-conscious experience of it. This is really when that awareness consciousness distinction comes into play. You might be aware of things just because you have eyes and ears and a nose and all that, but you're conscious of things because you're casting your mental consciousness on something in particular. Aquinas would argue that in the act of knowing, the knower knows that he or she is knowing. And when knowing that you are knowing throughout time, you form this diachronic sense sense of self, so that you are aware of yourself existing throughout time as an individual. An animal can actually be aware of its body, but it's not conscious of itself as an individual. Like, have you ever driven to work or school and it was like a 15-minute drive, and when you got there, you're like, you know what? I actually don't remember anything I just did. I mean, I know it's happened to me. I'll drive 15 minutes and I get there and I'm like, I don't even remember any of the trip. I was aware of the road. My legs were moving. My arms were steering the steering wheel. I was aware of everything, but my consciousness was somewhere else. It was thinking about the problem of animal suffering, or it was thinking about what I need to make for dinner. So I was aware the entire time, but I wasn't conscious of what was happening. And that's basically what's going on in the fawn. It's got this passive awareness of the suffering, but doesn't have an active consciousness of the suffering. It's actually just a few types of animals. There's possibly self-conscious, like elephants, dolphins, higher apes, and maybe a couple of others. Even the researchers who have tried to free chimpanzees and stuff like that, they argue that they're persons, but not on the level that humans are persons. I look at all the contemporary science on the issue, and I look at several things that animal researchers have looked at testing for self-consciousness in non-human animals, like
metacognition, which is the ability to think about your own thoughts,
abstract reasoning, and
episodic memory, which is a distinction between just remembering facts or remembering yourself as a being in that memory.
Episodic memory goes both ways. They think if you have the ability to remember yourself in the past, it's also coupled with this ability to think of yourself in the future. But animals aren't thought to have episodic memory. They can't think of themselves in the past, and they don't think of themselves in the future. They just live in this present in which they don't think of themselves as individuals either. In the research, sometimes they'll find that maybe one animal is promising for one of those things, like episodic memory or reasoning or metacognition. But what they'll find is that it's not a good candidate in the other two. Some people think that in certain cases, certain animals are showing signs of self-consciousness. But in every case, there's another researcher pushing back and saying, well, we think this is explainable just by associative learning, things that only have to happen on the level of particulars and don't necessarily involve immaterial forms. And in most cases, they show that the animals act like they know things, but they don't actually know it. It's an interesting intersection in animal minds and artificial intelligence. When they program computers to do a Turing test where they're trying to get computers to talk, it is notoriously impossible for them to get computers to act like language users. They can't abstract meaning from the sounds and the words. The animals also react to the sounds. But what they're trying to test for is, do the animals know what the sounds mean? You never see animals just pursuing the good for its own sake. You don't ever see a beaver just stepping back and saying, you know, why am I building this dam? I feel like I should go do something else with my life. They just do what's in their nature.
We don't think that animals have free will.
So whenever you train your dog to do a certain task, whenever you're going to give them a treat, is the dog thinking, my owner has presented a treat. If I roll over, I always get treats. Therefore, I should roll over now. That's a logical argument. And couched in all that is a bunch of abstract concepts, high-level logical syllogisms. But there's another way you could look at it, and this is what I was mentioning when I mentioned associative learning. It's associating an action with an outcome. What happens is they associate an action with an reward. When they see the treat, they associate it with a good feeling that they had. There doesn't have to be a high-level logical process going on. Some philosophers of mind have called it proto-logic. The Aristotelian standard for abstract reasoning is notoriously high. Animals don't have the level of rationality that is set by Aristotle and Aquinas. Animals have sensitive souls, so they are able to move themselves and procreate and all that stuff, and their consciousness of their environment. Humans have all the powers of animals and plants, but they also have the immaterial power of the mind. Aquinas explains exactly the difference between humans and animals. Ability to know things, which is a really specific metaphysical concept. It's when the active intellect, this immaterial power, abstracts a form from a particular thing in reality. And that's thought to only be possible with an immaterial active intellect. Intellect is not entirely dependent on a physical body. So there's something about you that can exist without a body.
Aquinas believes that we are a hylomorphic, a soul-body composite. If our body dies, we still exist because there's something about us that doesn't depend on the body for its functioning.
And that's the one thing that Aquinas thinks makes that you can survive the death of your body. And in theism, that means you're either going to go to heaven or hell.
But dead human is an incomplete human. So there is a Christian belief that we will be resurrected.
So if you're a believer and you think your pet is self-conscious, that entails logically from a theistic standpoint that your pet has has a rational soul. That means they're a moral being and they can sin. And you need to make sure that your pet is going to heaven, so you need to preach the gospel to them. Not only that, but let's think about it. If our pets are self-aware, what does it mean to own something that is self-conscious? It sounds like slavery to me. As crazy as it might sound, I argue that animal pain is a good thing, metaphysically good. At least from God's perspective, I don't find it problematic for God to allow animal suffering and that to be a logical or a moral issue. Aquinas, following philosophers like Augustine, had this privation view of evil.
Evil is real, like a hole is real. It's not like an illusion, but it's not real like the dirt around the hole is real.
For something to be an evil, it has to be a privation, for one, and it has to be a privation of a good that ought to be in something. It's an evil for a human to be blind, but it's not an evil for a rock to be blind. It's a privation in both things, but in a human, blindness is an evil because humans are meant to have sight, whereas rocks aren't. So when I took this privation view of evil and applied it to animal suffering, the first thing I noticed was that you can't really call animal pain and suffering evils because first and foremost, they're not privations. They have ontological status. When you feel pain, it's coming from a physiological existing system in your body. The sensation is real. It's not like a privation. So whether it's non-human animals or human beings, pain is not only something that has ontological status. So Aquinas would say it's metaphysically good, but it also ought to be in our world governed by natural laws. If you don't have the ability to feel pain, you're not going to survive very long. When Rose Fawn is suffering for 3 or 4 days, there is no point at which that fawn's suffering has no reason for being there.
For one metaphysical point, it's just natural that if you come into a finite world governed by physical laws, you had a beginning, and there's nothing in your nature that entails that you ought to never have an ending. Animals and human beings are by nature contingent. We're not self-sustaining like God is.
We know that from science. If you can't feel pain, there's so many little things in life that we take for granted that could actually kill us. But the ability to feel pain clues us to all of these things and helps us to make adjustments. Pain is the signal to the body to move away from whatever is causing the pain. But the unpleasantness of pain is an additional motivator that commands you to stop having that sensation of pain.
Humans definitely need the unpleasantness of pain to listen to the command that pain is giving them. If the pain isn't unpleasant, then it's not really going to compel you to avoid the thing that's causing the pain.
I think it was in the 1940s, there was a physician named Paul Brand, and he was working on leprosy patients in India. And one of the things they did was that they would actually they attach these little lights on them because they had lost a lot of feeling and especially the ability to feel pain in things like their hands. So if they were, say, turning a screwdriver at work too much and putting too much pressure on their hand, it would flash a light and it would tell them to stop doing whatever they were doing that made the light go off. But what they found in their studies was that really didn't do much of anything. It didn't stop them from doing whatever task they wanted it to do. Eventually in the study, they put some like little electric things on it. So if you were turning a screwdriver too hard, it wouldn't just flash a light. It would actually shock you. And this worked a little bit, but whenever the workers discovered they could just turn the machine off and do their task, they observed them doing that. If without the ability to feel pain, organisms are more task-oriented and less oriented to preserving their own body. Congenital insensitivity to pain, it's a really rare disease, but some people have been born without the ability to feel pain, and it's really tragic because these kids never live to be older than 2 years. Even things like depression, fear, just about every single emotion that you could think of that's thought to have negative connotations, they all have survival benefit. They are
homeostatic emotions. It's something built into you so that when you feel that, you perform the action that is going to remove you from the situation.
Obviously, fear keeps you alive. Depression is thought to be social survival mechanism. David Hume, in some of his writings, actually mentioned that God could have made the world so that we don't feel pain at all. Maybe there could just be two states. You either don't feel pleasure and you do feel pleasure. If you're doing something that's going to hurt yourself, you just stop feeling the pleasure. And to gain that pleasure sensation again, you quit doing the thing that's going to hurt you. I just don't find that to be plausible at all. You felt pleasure all day long, then you're taking away awards that your body gives you. We get endorphins, and that actually heightens sensations of pleasure we get. And that's something that you experience when you're doing things like having sex, eating, drinking, and not only animal suffering have a purpose, and it's not an evil thing that God should prevent, but even then, even if we thought he should prevent it, we can't say that we can know that for certain.
There's logical problems with arguing that God is held to a certain ethical standard. Let's say that there's some rule that says God can't create a world with death in it. The problem with trying to hold God to that standard is that where does that standard come from? You'd have to basically say there's some law above God. It's the answer to the Euthyphro. We don't think it's some standard above him, and we don't think it's arbitrary. We think it flows from his nature. The problem with holding God to a consequentialist standard is the problem of no best world. He wouldn't create anything whatsoever, because any world he creates is not going to be the best possible. Any world that God creates could have had one more good thing in it. So there's just logical problems with holding God to a duty standard or a consequentialist standard. So what you're left with is the virtue theory of the ancients and the medievals, according to virtue theory. Good action is the one that flows from these virtues like love, justice.
Basically, Aquinas says
The only thing that can understand God is God.
to know what God's justice require in this situation, we would have to know God's infinite essence. Because we have finite, contingent minds, we
Can't know the infinite.
can't know God's essence. And because we can't know his essence, we can't know how he ought to act in any given situation. One of the questions that Aquinas and other medieval philosophers were dealing with was,
If God is perfect, immaterial, infinite, timeless, spaceless. He exists as a trinity. He's not even lonely because he's enjoying this eternal fellowship among the three persons of the... So why would he even want to create anything?
when we do things, when we perform actions, we do them for a reason, and it's usually to obtain some good. So if I go to the movies, I'm looking for a new experience. If I'm trying to obtain a degree, I'm wanting to gain knowledge. In all these cases, we're gaining something that we don't have, but God is infinitely perfect, and there is nothing that he wants for or needs. So, why would he create anything? Following thinkers like Pseudo-Dionysius, Aquinas thought that because God is all loving, and because when we look in the world, we see that when people have love, it's not something they want to keep to themselves, then it seems that God would be inclined to create a world where he could share his love. When you have love, it's not like finding a golden nugget or a diamond, right? You don't want to stash it to yourself. You want to give the love to other people. It's actually better when you're sharing with other people.
Even the exclusive love between a husband and a wife ends up spreading that love in making children.
The reason why God created anything was to share his love,
Was to communicate his goodness, his perfection to other beings. The Bible says that God created to glorify himself. And that might sound narcissistic.
I really love the way Aquinas put it because it makes sense out of what it means for God to glorify himself.
These medieval philosophers, theologians, especially Aquinas, thought, what kind of world would that look like? From that view of that philosophical argument, that God has created the world to communicate his goodness. God can't just make another immaterial, infinitely perfect thing, because that would be him, and you can't create an uncreated being. You can't have two infinite beings. He can't create himself. He does make immaterial angels, but just making angels wouldn't communicate to a high degree his goodness. God needs to make a hierarchy of being that's going to point metaphysically upwards to his infinite perfection. He needs to make a world that shows all the different ways that being is, kind of giving us a clue to what infinite being would be like. So he's basically having to work with contingent physical reality.
Because he's ordering everything to his goodness, he needs to order it with physical laws. It's also going to be governed by a moral law because it has moral beings in it.
If he doesn't order it with laws, it's just going to be a mishmash of stuff, and it's not going to tell anybody anything. He needs to make things all the way down from the elements to rocks, water, to plants that have vegetative souls. And then another more perfect way to live is the sensitive beings, the animals. And then above that, you've got rational soul, human beings who not only have all the powers of the souls beneath them, they grow and they take in nutrients and they move, but they also have the rational soul, the ability to know reality, to have free will, to choose what you're going to do. Aquinas thinks that's why we have an intellect and a will, because that's our whole purpose, to know God, to love God, to choose God.
Because that's the whole point of creating, is to share his love, and you can't share love if there's no one to know you and to love you.
We are, by nature, cognizers of the good. We're made to understand the good, to want that good.
The hierarchy is meant to point metaphysically upward to God's goodness, first of all. But the hierarchy also is there to support human beings. Animals just are a part of this hierarchy of being, which is all in place to not only provide a habitat for humanity, which is almost the whole point of creating, and everything in the hierarchy below human beings is for the good of human beings. All that entails common sense, stewardship. Anytime we come into a situation that's questionable over how we should treat animals, we need to couple Aquinas' thought on why God created the universe, why he created animals in the first place, and his virtue ethics. We need to consider, is what we are doing virtuous, and are we being being good stewards of what God gave us. There's going to be a lot of gray areas, when you start talking about industrial animal farms and things like that. But as far as can I go kick any dog I see, the answer is no, because you're not supposed to mistreat things that are there for your good just for your entertainment. If I gave my 2 sons cars and they turn around and took those cars and decided to have a demolition derby with them just to entertain themselves, I wouldn't be happy, because that's not what I meant those cars for. If you mistreat animals, that is going to become a habit that is going to damage you as a human being, because it's going to become a vice and it's going to spill over into other human beings as well. So it's not surprising the world that we see according to classical theism. When you have a finite world, you're just going to have what you see in nature. You're making this contingent world with contingent creatures governed by natural laws. You better put the ability to feel pain in them. But also, classical theism predicts that any world that God makes is going to have
intelligent, rational beings, because the only reason why God would have created is to communicate his goodness and to have beings that can know and love him. Naturalism doesn't predict that there's going to be intelligent beings. If you're talking about a blind world, the probability of a bunch of molecules coming together and making an intelligent being
is a cosmic accident.
So actually, theism has more explanatory power than naturalism does.
The no design hypothesis doesn't predict any world. Even David Hume's world, where you don't have pain, is just as probable if everything is random. One of the major problems with the no design hypothesis is it doesn't have the metaphysical tools necessary to even ground concepts like premature death. If animals weren't created by anything for any purpose, then for an animal to live 10 years versus 20 years, it doesn't matter, because they weren't meant to live 20 years. They weren't meant to live any years. It's a physical miracle that they exist in the first place.